There we go. Okay. Uh, Here's the thing about the purchase agreement is it's going to take us longer than an hour to be able to get through all of the pieces. And so don't hesitate to ask questions. I know we're not going to get through the whole purchase agreement today. We'll pick it up again next time. But yeah, if you have any questions as we're going through, just let me know
Okay.
and we'll go from there. We're going to go over, oh, where's my share button? Share screen. There we go. We're going to go over the residential purchase agreement in Minnesota. I know North Dakota is a little different, but a lot of the terms are similar. Uh, and so either way, you'll need to know each one for even our people in North Dakota. Um, okay. Can you see my purchase agreement up here? We're good to go?
Yep.
Cool. All
We're good.
right. So here's the Minnesota purchase agreement and transaction desk. You'll see that everything's numbered. All the lines on the purchase agreement are numbered. So if you ever need to change anything within the purchase agreement, when you do an amendment or addendum, you can just reference the line that you're changing and do that. Now, caveat to that, we do not change the legal language that is in here. So the only things that we should be changing is anything that we're filling out in the first place, right? The biggest piece about not striking anything is these are all put together by lawyers. And if you
Mhm.
strike something from the purchase agreement, you don't always realize or know where else in the purchase agreement that line references or attaches to. So just be very careful and thorough when you are doing amendments to strike something or change something. And if you ever have any questions, you can always call your managing directors and we can walk you through things. So that piece is pretty easy. Line one is the date. And this is the date that you are writing the purchase agreement, that you start drafting it. Okay. This is not the final acceptance date. This is not the date that the parties signed. This is the date that you start drafting this document. This date becomes important because then every addendum and amendment going forward will reference this date right
Mhm.
here. Okay. So make sure that that date's filled in. Make sure that you then reference that date as you go on. Line two just tells you what page you're on. Okay, that one's pretty easy. Line three and four are for your buyer's names. Now, when your buyer's names should be their legal names because that's how they're going to have to sign the closing documents. That's what's going to be on their deed. So like I go by Katie, but my legal name is Caitlin. And so my name on here should be Caitlin Larson instead of Katie Larson. The other thing that you can think about in here is whether or not your buyers want tenants in common or joint tenancy when they're taking the deed, which which would affect what happens if one of them die and where their property interest goes. Okay, so we did a whole nother video about joint tenancy and tenants in common. And I'm sure you guys did it in your classes, but you can put in here like my husband and I, right? Katie Larson and Benjamin Soderberg. We are married, but because we have different last names, not everybody knows that. So we want to be joint tenants in this. And it's that easy to fill that out that way. Okay. When you're doing an LLC, when the buyers are buying the property in an LLC or a trust or some other corporation, the name of that trust corporation entity will be in these lines. So like we have our Soderson Trust. So my husband and I have a trust called the Soderson Trust. Okay. If we were going to buy a property in the trust's name, we would still sign, my husband and I, we would sign the purchase agreement in our names, but the name of the buyer on here is going to be the trust because that is the entity buying the property.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Next piece talks about earnest money, line five through line 11 talks about the earnest money. Now, the earnest money is required to be given to the listing agent and or the seller, depending on who's holding it, within 3 days of final acceptance. Okay. If you use trust funds, that means that as soon as you get final acceptance, you need to be submitting that trust funds to your buyer. That also means that when you're filling this out with your buyer, you need to let your buyer know that this money, whatever amount you put in here, let's say it's $2,000, that payment needs to be submitted within 3 days, whether they're writing a check with you when you're writing the offer or they're doing trust funds on the date of final acceptance. Okay. If they do not get it to the seller or the listing agent within that 3 business days, your buyers are in breach of contract and the seller can cancel if they choose.
Yep.
Okay. Um, Now another piece about this, a lot of our agents, especially if it's our listing and the commission is, or the earnest money is more than the commission we're going to receive, they will sometimes have the title company hold the earnest money. And that's completely fine, but you have to call that out within the purchase agreement. How it's written is that the listing broker is the one that's going to hold the earnest money always, unless you check this box here on line 7 and then name who's going to hold it. As a listing agent, when you're getting a purchase agreement and you know you want the earnest money to be held somewhere different and not with us, then you would do a counteroffer changing this line right here so that everybody's aware of where that earnest money is going to be held. Okay. Any questions about that? No? Pretty good? Okay. Then it talks about the actual property. Okay. There's a place on here for street address, which you would fill out. Now, if you're using transaction desk, this stuff will automatically be filled in depending on how much property information you're putting into transaction desk. But you can also just fill it in like this, right? You're going to put in the street address, the city, the county. Um, because this is a Minnesota purchase agreement that says state of Minnesota already, okay? And the zip code. Now, we do not sell properties by address or by parcel ID number in the county. We sell properties by legal description. So it
Mm-hmm.
is very important that this legal description that you put in here is accurate and it's all of it. Not all counties have the full legal description on the tax statement. They'll do an abbreviated version. Okay. And abbreviated versions are fine as long as everyone's aware that this is an abbreviated version. So how you would do that is you would put abbreviated, ABB, and here's the legal description. All of this will pull over in transaction desk. As long as you're writing the offer from the listing, this will pull over directly. Or if you're pulling the information into transaction desk from the county, the legal description will pull over, but just always double check, always make sure it's right. Sometimes what happens is that the legal description, I'm just going to write a whole bunch of stuff here, will be super long and it'll try to fit it all in this one line here. So as you're filling out the purchase agreement, you might want to grab some of it and put it on the next line down. Okay, just that's just a piece. That doesn't truly matter. It needs to be there. It needs to be readable. Any
Now,
question?
should I
Yeah.
throw a curveball at you?
Please do. Yes, I love those.
Okay. So I have a cabin. It's
Hmm.
in a resort. I
Hmm.
pay taxes on said cabin
Hmm.
to the county,
Hmm.
but I do not have a legal description because it is a cabin with no land.
Okay.
Now, if I list this through our real estate outfit
Hmm.
and we do a purchase agreement, what do you
Hmm.
put in there for legal description? Because there is not one.
No, so you would put in what you're selling. So you would be selling your partial interest in property that the cabin is on, right?
Well, there's no partial um, grounds. I own absolutely zero land, but I own a cabin. But because it's a cabin, I get taxed on it through Otter Tail County.
Is it leased land?
Nope, nope,
No?
nope. It is rented, and every year I pay lot rent for the cabin, but I also pay
Yep.
taxes to the county.
Okay. So what does the county have as your legal description on there?
They have cabin 3 in the resort, and that's it.
Okay.
So there is no legal description, and yet I still pay taxes.
Yes. So
So
that's what I would put in here. If county has it named as cabin 3 of here, of whatever resort, that's what I would name it here. And then
yeah,
in those cases, just to be over and above and have everyone be well aware of which property we're talking about, I would put the parcel ID number in there. Hubbard County or Otter Tail County, parcel ID number this. Because you're right, it doesn't have an actual legal description because that describes the land,
exactly. It
right?
doesn't
But
go with
it
it.
but it is being taxed as real property,
Exactly. So
not
like I
personal
said,
property. Yeah. Yep. So just be careful. Then there's a then there's a question that comes, this is probably over and above what we should talk about here today, but then a problem becomes is that actually personal property or is it real property at that point?
exactly. And you can't count the cabin as real estate because it is not tied to a legal description that describes the property to which it sits
Right.
on.
And you
So
don't have an interest.
I
So the
don't.
other ways that they do that is it's in a common interest community. So
Right,
they own uh just an interest in the whole with everybody else. And so
right,
that's all they're selling is that interest. So in
right,
that case, you would do, a third interest in blah 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 blah.
right.
So that's another way that it comes up. If you ever run into these and you're not sure, this is for everybody watching at home. If you ever run into these and you're not sure, call your managing director.
Mm.
They'll walk you through it for sure. Okay. Always, and as you're representing the buyer, you should always be checking the legal description that the listing agent is putting into the system. Scary story from a long time ago. We had the wrong legal description. This was 20 years ago, so nothing was automated, right? Everything was typed in. We
Mm.
had the wrong legal description of the property. The agent used the property next door, that legal description, and sold the wrong property legally. So
Whoops.
when that buyer, who then became a seller, went to go sell, the deed that they have was actually for the neighboring property, not for the property that they had been occupying. Had to get legal involved and they had to go through all of their steps and all of their pieces, and we got it fixed. But it's important to double check your legal description, whether you're listing a property or whether you represent a buyer, to make sure that that legal description is correct. I know that legal descriptions can be very confusing. Take the time to learn at least the very basics on how to read them and how to find them.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. The next piece then talks about fixtures and appurtenances. And if you remember from your classes, fixtures and appurtenances are anything attached to the property. So if you think of, it's not personal property, right? So if you think of, like, if you took the house and you flipped it on its head, anything that falls would be personal property that can be moved, that can be taken. It is not a part of this purchase agreement. Okay, not as written. Anything that is still there, it's still holding on to that property that doesn't fall, that's a fixture or an appurtenance. It's attached to the property and therefore it's being sold with the home. On the
Well,
li Yep.
what about a flagpole that's out in the front yard?
Is it a stick-in like a shepherd's hook?
No, it is a cemented in base with a aluminum flagpole and my personal residence here, and they took the flagpole and left a hole in the ground.
Yep. So these are where it becomes tricky. You're not wrong. So with that flagpole, if it's like a shepherd's hook where all they do is stick it in the ground, then it's personal property. Okay.
Right.
If it's cemented in and bolted into that cement,
Yep.
it is not personal property. It becomes a
Yep.
fixture,
Yep.
which means if the seller wants to take that with them, they can, but only if they put it in the purchase agreement
Exactly.
saying that these items are excluded.
Yep.
Okay. Same thing with your buyers. If they want to include things that are personal property, the couch, the appliances, because those are usually not built in,
Mhm.
right? They're not attached to the property, they're just plugged into the wall.
Unless it's
Those
a
need,
microwave.
and depending on the microwave, yep, you're right. And so make sure you call all of those things out. One of the things that I see often is that agents will um be in a hurry. I don't want to say get lazy because our
Oh,
agents are not lazy, but they do get in a hurry and they'll just say all personal property seen
all
in
appliances.
property on this date. So unless you have pictures of what that personal property is and the sellers agreed, yep, that's what that personal property was that was there on that date, that's not going to hold water in court. If
Yep.
you're selling a cabin that has a lot of personal property, you should be doing an inventory on
Right.
all of that,
Yep.
right? And I've seen where the agent just goes and takes pictures, attaches the pictures to the offer, and says all of this personal property, and the seller signs off. That's okay. That's okay. But you
If
better
it's
make sure
a,
that you better make sure you're opening the cabinets so
yeah.
that the plates that the buyer's also buying are in that picture, right? Most of the time, we don't have to deal with this. We try to have the buyer and seller deal with big personal property outside of the sale, not within the sale. A lot of that comes from the property might not appraise if the buyer's buying the pontoon with the property. The property might not appraise for the purchase price of the home plus the price of the pontoon. Okay. And so then the buyer would have to come up with more cash to be able to buy the property because the bank is not going to finance personal property within a
Yep.
30-year mortgage. They're just
Yep.
not. So what we usually do is any personal property we put on a separate addendum. We have one called the Coldwell Banker Crown Realtors CBCR Personal Property Agreement. And that's an agreement outside of this purchase agreement between the buyer and the seller about all that personal property. Okay. Okay. This does have garden bulbs, plants, shrubs, trees, lawn watering systems, in-ground pet containment systems,
Hmm.
sheds, play sets, storm sashes, storm doors, screens and awnings, window shades and blinds, and on and on and on and on and on. They've called out all of these things in particular because clients were not sure what fixtures and appurtenances were.
Hmm.
Okay. So they've listed all of these things in here to just make absolutely sure that everyone was aware that this is the things that we mean when we say fixtures and appurtenances. This is not a full list. It says including but not limited to blah, 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 blah. Okay. This is not a full list, but these are most of the things that people don't think about. Speaker mounts, wall and ceiling speaker mounts. Okay. Those are supposed to stay with the property. TV wall mounts, when you mount your TV to the wall, which most people do, those wall mounts are attached to the property. The TV is not. Okay.
Mm.
All of these different pieces. Any attached mirrors. So if the mirror is attached and can't just be picked up and moved, but you have to unscrew something to be able to remove the mirror, it's attached. On another note, with your listing, please make sure your seller isn't removing the mirrors when they move out. We have had that happen as well, where there was no mirrors in the property when we went.
Oh,
There's always weird things that people come up with. Okay. So that's what all of this wonderful wording is. One of the things that the state has put in here just recently is play sets. Previously, play sets were not included. They were not or I'm sorry, they were not fixtures or appurtenances. They were seen as personal property because most of them were not attached to the ground in some way because they're heavy enough where they don't have to be, right? For the
mhm.
kids to use it. They have now included it in the purchase agreement. And I call that out because some sellers are upgrading their home, but they still have the same kids and they want to take their playset with them.
Mm.
If they want to do that, you just have to make sure that they exclude it from whatever offer that they're accepting. Okay,
Mm.
that's all. This goes on to talk about any control units, internet connected hardware, thermostats. We have all seen the Nest thermostats from the smart homes, right, that are in the property. Those stay with the property. Okay. They are seen as a fixture or appurtenance. On that same note, any software, permissions, passwords, codes, and access information have to be given to the buyer at closing. Okay. Just FYI.
Mm.
Okay. What else should I call out in here? All of these are built-ins that they're talking about. So if the seller, a built-in is if the seller has to remove trim to be able to get that appliance out, it is considered a built-in. It is considered a fixture. It has to stay with the property unless you specifically exclude it. Okay. Do 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 do.
Now, I don't see gun safes on here either.
Gun safes are not on here because not all gun safes are affixed to the property. But you're right to call that out, Terry, is that if there are some gun safes that are drilled into the concrete,
Mhm.
okay, or built into a closet. If that's the case, it becomes a fixture and appurtenance.
Yep.
Okay. So again, they can take it with them, but they gotta exclude it. As long as it's in writing, it's fine, but it's gotta be in writing. Okay. Now this talks about liquid fuel tanks and all controls. This is it's set so most of our properties in greater Minnesota have propane tanks that are on the outside of the home, okay? If those propane tanks are attached to the house in any way, they have to stay with the property. Some of our sellers, not a lot of them, very few, own the propane tanks straight out. They're not rented from a propane company.
Right.
um, that ownership will be transferred at closing per this purchase agreement. Okay. Now we'll get to later in the purchase agreement, we'll talk about the actual propane in those propane tanks or fuel oil in those fuel oil tanks. This is just talking about the actual tank, not what's inside. Okay.
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 Now, what about
Mhm.
solar recharging type setups and wind generators?
Yeah, so again, depends on if they're attached and how they're attached. So if they're just attached on mounts like a TV, right, where you
Right.
just put it on and you're not unscrewing anything to take it off, then it technically would not be included. It wouldn't be a fixture. If it is screwed onto anything, it becomes a fixture.
Well, like a lot of the bigger wind generators, they do come with a tower that is cemented
Mhm.
and guy wires and the whole 9 yards. What do you normally do with that?
Yeah, that would be a fixture. And
Okay.
if you're ever unsure whether or not it's counted as a fixture or not, write it in. Then there's no room for negotiation. There's no room for anybody to say, "Wait, that was not attached. It's not a fixture," because you've written it in as an extra. So if you're ever not sure whether or not something will count as a fixture, for instance, a shed. We've moved sheds all the time.
Yep.
If the shed is not on a solid foundation, it is not included for the purchase agreement.
Hmm.
You have to call it out, right? So if it's just up on blocks because a company just came and sat it right there, you need to be adding it as personal property in here, just like you would with the appliances. So same thing with those. If you're not sure, just write it in.
Okay. One other little add-on with water collection units. So
Hmm.
somebody has a hydroponic garden and they want to do the water collection. Typically, they're not going to be a mounted situation, but they're going to have gutters that attach to the structure.
Right. So that becomes like the TV, right? That the mount is included. The mount is a fixture, but maybe not the barrel that's catching the water,
Mm,
right? So the gutters would be included, but maybe not the hose lines that run out to their garden. Yep. Yep. These are really good questions. I super appreciate you asking these things. Because it's so much easier when people are here and I can explain. Yeah.
Well, and I have one other one, and it has to do with inside the garage because some guys have a two-post lift or a four-post lift.
Hmm.
Some of the four-post lifts, they don't actually anchor them in the concrete.
Hmm. Hmm.
So are
Yep.
those going to be considered a fixture?
They are not. So if they're
Okay,
not anchored, then they do not stay.
gotcha.
Hmm. If they're anchored, like usually the two post ones
Yep.
will be anchored, then
Yep.
they're a fixture.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're on the seller side and they want to take their lift with them, just make sure you exclude it. And even if it is a four post lift, because it's such a big structure, I would always put it in writing anyway. Even though I know and the seller knows and the buyer knows that this is coming with us, right? This is coming with the seller and not staying with the property, I would still put it in writing so that there is no question. If you have to go to a court and tell a judge, you can be like, I put it in writing. Everyone was aware, and here's all of their signatures showing that they were aware that this was coming with us. I'm sorry
Okay.
that they thought it was attached. It's not. And even if it was, we've now excluded it.
Now I've got one other one here. I have to back up
Hmm.
because on my security system here, I have what's known as a range booster for my Wi-Fi.
Hmm.
It's not mounted to anything,
Hmm.
and yet it plugs into the wall and it transmits a signal to all of my exterior components of my security system.
Hmm.
So
Not
are we adding
attached.
that? Not attached. Okay.
Not attached. Nope. So same thing with your router, right? If you own your router,
Yeah.
you just plug it into a wall. Or a lot of them, they just sit on the wall like a picture, right? You put a screw into the wall and they just sit right there,
Yep.
not attached.
Okay.
So if the buyer wants that, they need to make sure they ask for it. Hmm. Most of the time, like in those situations where you have the booster specifically for a security system that is attached to the property, in those situations, most of the time the seller is just going to include it with the sale. But as a buyer's agent, you want to make sure that that is included. just in case. Same thing with the Nest thermostat. Sellers never have an intention to take the Nest thermostats with them when they go, right? Most people are like, that's a thermostat that stays with the house. But what they forget about is all the login information, all the permissions. Same
Hmm.
thing. I have an app for my garage doors. So I can open them and close them wherever I am in the world, right? If I sell my house, that information, that ownership has to be transferred to the buyer. hmm Which is what all this is right here. Permissions, passwords, codes, access information, all of that. Okay. What else you got for me about personal property?
That quite
No,
a bit of it actually.
right? No, I think we covered a lot in there. That's great. Um, One other thing that I wanted to call out, and then we'll move on, is that in this piece of the purchase agreement, it talks about that this personal property and the following personal property shall be transferred with no additional monetary value and free and clear of all liens and encumbrances. So you can put, microwave range. This is usually what we see. Refrigerator. Don't put etc. I was going to put etc. Don't put etc. I'm going to say etc. because you know all the other
Mhm.
things. Okay. Then the excluded piece will be down here. These things will be excluded from the purchase. Okay. All right. Line 37 to 39 talks about the purchase price. This is the actual amount that the buyer's going to pay for the home. Right? So $350,000. You'll see as I fill this out, it'll fill it out in Word form on the bottom. It does the same thing when you're doing earnest money up here. When you fill this out, it puts the word in here as well. Okay. You need both in our contracts. Yay for us. The next piece, 41 to 46, talks about how the buyer is going to pay for this. So they're either going to pay cash, or they're going to get their own mortgage, or they're going to assume the seller's current mortgage, or they're going to ask the seller for a contract for deed, or they're going to do a combination of all of those. Okay. What we usually see, well, cash is easy. Buyers paying cash, this becomes 100%. Okay. Most of the time, it's a conventionally financed loan. So line 41 would be 20%, and line 42 would
Mhm.
be 80%, right? So 20% of this 350,000 is going to be in cash. Cash means that money is in their bank right now, ready to go. Okay. What we have been seeing lately, uh, and I'm just warning you guys now, those are normally the ones that we see. If they're going to do a combination of all four, you can do percentages from there, right? The buyer doesn't have to for sure get those percentages, but if the buyer has to come up with 25% cash down, because that's what their mortgager requires, but we've got 20 and 80 in here, and it's contingent on them financing the property, the buyer can then back out because of that extra 5%, because they can't get financing at the terms we have set in the purchase agreement.
Hmm.
If the buyer chooses to get financing at the term or at different terms, and they're like, yeah, that's fine, I've got an extra 5%, then you don't have to do anything, right? But that's why it's important to fill these out and have them be what the buyer is comfortable with when they're buying a property. Okay. Now, I was saying what we are seeing is that buyers are pulling money out like a HELOC, okay? and they're putting on their offers that it's 100% cash, which is true because they're not getting financing for this particular property. They're financing their current property with a HELOC and using that to pay.
Mm.
So it
Yeah.
is cashed. You're not wrong. But as a buyer's agent, you then need to put another contingency in this purchase agreement saying that this purchase agreement is contingent on the buyer's successful approval of their HELOC for their current property. Okay. So they're
Mm.
not wrong. It is cash, but to protect your buyer and protect their earnest money, you need to make sure that it's contingent on the HELOC. Again, that's up to the buyer. You can explain that to them, you can tell that to them. But if they choose to gamble and say, no, I'm pretty certain that I'm going to get the HELOC, I'm not going to worry about it, just go ahead and write it as is. I don't want it contingent on that. Okay, fine. That's fine. But you do have a duty to let the seller know that this is going to be a HELOC. That's how we're getting the cash. Same thing if they're pulling money out of a retirement account to be able to pay cash for this. There's a disclosure piece that you need to have if you're not going to make it contingent. There's a disclosure piece that you need to have in the purchase agreement, usually in the other category towards the very end. Is where you'd put that. But for now, most of ours are 2080 or 595 or 397 with their cash down and their mortgage financing.
And if things change, so let's say you have a buyer and
Mhm.
they're going to do a mortgage on the property, but the mortgage lender flat out refuses to give them all of the details to which the loan has for numbers,
Mhm.
and you're getting down to the final month before the closing, and the buyer says, "The hell with the mortgage officer! I'm just going to pay for it cash." Do you need
Mhm.
to change things then on the purchase agreement since they're now changing the entire contract?
Nope, because it's what the buyer feels comfortable with, right? So the numbers that you put into here as you're writing the purchase agreement are are numbers, particularly in the mortgage financing piece, that they feel comfortable. If I can get this type of mortgage, this is what they're telling the seller. If I can get this type of mortgage at these terms, then I will buy your property. If I'm not able to get this mortgage at these terms,
Mhm.
and this purchase agreement is contingent on financing, buyer can say, yeah, I'm not going to buy it because I can't get this mortgage at these terms. Okay. So, difference in your situation, buyer's frustrated with the lender and it's just like, I'm just going to go pay cash. That's fine. That doesn't need a new amendment or addendum to the purchase agreement. Now, you can, for clarity's sake, for all parties, right? You can do that. But if they change their mind and it's that you don't need to follow up with anything like that. Hmm.
Okay. When I bought my
Yeah.
property here in Moorhead, that's exactly what happened.
Okay.
The
It
lender
sounded
flat out,
like a personal story. Yeah.
yeah, the lender flat out refused to give me all the parameters to which the loan was, being secured with the
Mhm.
interest rate, everything as far as the monthly payment, the whole 9 yards. He wouldn't give me any numbers whatsoever.
Mhm.
And so I had to end up saying, well, that we're going to go separate ways. And I just pulled money out of where I needed to pull it out of, and I paid cash for the house. So in that
Okay.
aspect, they did ask me to satisfy the mortgage contingency and and waive that altogether. So.
So, and that my guess would be that would be a push from the listing agent. Because if I was a listing agent on the other side and the buyer's
Mhm.
agent called me and said, hey, they're just so you know, they're not going to get a mortgage anymore. They're just going to pay cash. To protect my sellers, I'd absolutely want the buyer to
Yeah,
go ahead and
yeah.
remove their financing contingency then. As a buyer's agent, we don't have a duty to do that because our buyers are more protected with that mortgage financing contingency. But as a listing agent, as a seller's agent, absolutely I'd ask for that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Does the buyer have to give it to me? No. No. I agree with your face. If that's what the buyer's decided, is the buyer
Right,
going to fight you on it? Probably not,
right.
right? But this is a legally binding contract the way it's written. Neither party has to amend anything. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So it's super fun. Line 48 then talks about the closing date. Okay. Now on here, when you set the closing date, you're usually, if they're getting mortgage financing, about 6 weeks out. Closing date is always negotiable between buyer and seller, what works best for their schedules and to make sure everything falls into place. But there has to be a solid closing date in here, even if you're making the offer contingent on the sale of the buyer's property and you have no idea when that's going to close. So you want to put TBD in this closing date area to be determined. You cannot. It makes the contract,
Unenforceable.
cancelable,
Mhm.
unenforceable. That's
Mhm.
exactly.
Yep.
Okay. There has to be an end date here. So if it is the case where it's a sale of home contingency that's requiring that closing date to be kind of up in the air, right? We're hoping it'll close by the end of July, but we're not totally sure. You can make this closing date longer. Maybe you want to go to September just in case, but it is a negotiating tool between you and the seller, right? Maybe the seller doesn't want to be held into a contract until September. Maybe they want something sooner, but there has to be some kind of date in here. For cash closings, you usually can be about 2 weeks, give or take. Always check with your title company when you're filling out these closing dates to make sure that they have room in their schedule to be able to close it on time. And then always check with the mortgage lender for what their time frame is as well. Okay. I think we're going to stop there because the next piece we're going to talk about is the mortgage financing, and I know I can't get through that in 10 minutes. Um,
Perfect.
um, so that is what we're going to end with today. Thanks so much for your wonderful questions, Terry. I super appreciate it. And we will catch you guys next week.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Bye.